think anytime we hear a story about leadership, we look at it like it's common sense. But common sense is not common practice. And I think hearing the stories that these leaders provide give all of us a roadmap to being better at influencing other people.
I can't think of a better time to take advantage of the literally hundreds of years of experience that you will glean in a very succinct and practical way through the wonderful stories that are included in this book.
Each chapter in this book represents a different leader who is willing to share and impart their knowledge and wisdom to turn you into a leader.
The stories are inspiring and illustrative, and they offer insightful and practical advice from exceptional leaders who have achieved extraordinary accomplishments, transformations, and change.
I know that I've always found the most important thing I can do is watch other leaders. What makes them successful, and what can I emulate that might make me a better leader?
The personal stories of how individual leaders overcame the challenges that they were facing is going to be most helpful to people.
I think one of the things folks can get out of this book is learning from someone else's mistakes, right? I've learned a lot from my own mistakes along the way, and have been able to share some of that.
These are amazing people with incredible backgrounds offering their own lessons of experience to all of us.
The biggest takeaway from Lessons from Leaders is that there's a wide variety of leadership styles, and it's important that you find the best style for you and be genuine to yourself.
The more you understand how leadership contributes to the goals and objectives of the organization, the better you're going to be at helping everybody to fit in, participate, and bring their best selves to work together.
Hi everyone, and welcome to today's session. Please let us know where you're joining from in the chat section. We are thrilled to have you with us for a conversation on leadership, and we look forward to sharing some of the key leadership lessons from the book, Lessons from Leaders. Lessons from Leaders is a diverse collection of candid stories from 15 remarkable leaders who share their insights, experiences, and the practical lessons we can all learn to shape our leadership journeys. With that, I would like to introduce to you to today's host, Sam Shriver, the Executive Vice President of Thought Leadership and Training Transfer at the Center for Leadership Studies, the author of From Coach to Coach, The 4 Moments of Truth, and co-author of Lessons from Leaders. Welcome, Sam.
Susie, thank you very much. Thanks to Eric as well for all of your guidance behind the scenes technically. Thanks to everybody on the Center for Leadership Studies staff. While I'm passing out, thank yous, sincere thanks to Marshall Goldsmith and Kathy McDermott, my co-authors on this project. So very, very glad we did it. And sincere thanks to everybody here that I see signing in from literally all over the world. Thank you for giving up whatever you're giving up for this next hour to hear from Justin. I think you're going to be very, very impressed with what he has to say.
Yes, today we have Justin with us, who is one of the extraordinary leaders from the book and someone who was interviewed to share some of his leadership experience and insights. He is a progressive pastor with an innovative and rapidly growing church who is leading positive change in a historically traditional space. So thank you so much, Justin, for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Susie and Sam. I've honestly been really looking forward to this and grateful for this book and even the chance to revisit it together this afternoon.
Thank you. All right, Sam, over to you.
Yeah, well, again, Susie, thank you very much. And Justin, while Susie was reading your background, I got a question one time, from somebody that read through the book, and he said, what exactly does it mean, progressive pastor? Like what is that description? What is as opposed to just like a regular old pastor, I guess, or not necessarily old. What is that word progressive in front of the word pastor? Like what does that mean, and how is it different, if at all?
Yeah, man, that's a great question. So I think it's actually a label that's more been put on me than one that I've adopted myself, but if I assume best intent, I think it would be not necessarily a political assignment so much as the idea that a deep belief or conviction that the church has a role in the future, and that we need to be present 50 or 100 years from now. We need to continue to make moves forward and to progress in the way that we do what we do while staying true to kind of our core values and principles. And so I think that's probably what most people would mean when they're talking about progressive, is just that we're willing to kind of mess with the mechanics of it a little bit and to try some new things rather than to just try and preserve something from, the old.
Yeah, I think too, and I have been, had the distinct honor and pleasure of attending many of your services, both live and virtual over time. And I will tell you, you are a pastor from the pulpit that you get people to think. And it's not always about like, wow, I agree with what this person has to say or his interpretation. But the thing that mostly that you think about, I think, is some people go to church and they just want confirmation, or like, no pun intended there, but they want confirmation for just what they've always known, and what it's a very predictable sort of a thing. You kind of take an edge with it, and you say, if Jesus was here today and was watching this,
right.
Where would he be? Who would he be hanging around with? What would that look like? So again, I'm glad you clarified that, because I've always thought that the word progressive with you, it just was more of a descriptor that basically said, what would Jesus be doing in this day and age? And of course, what we've got to do is, kind of make a little conjecture there, but in that regard, it's a very thoughtful opportunity. Now, I think one of the most interesting stories about you, and I've heard it a couple times, but most people here have not. So please do me the favor of telling this again. You almost didn't make it through screening to become a pastor. There was some kind of aptitude test or whatever that you had to take for, ready to, kind of go through your final exam, or for lack of a better term. Could you, just to kind of get us rolling, tell that story, and then we will move on from there to talk about all kinds of things leadership related.
Absolutely. So this is one of my favorite stories too, and it's one that I think I continue to revisit. Makes me feel sane in days where I feel really out of place. But I would say even today, I often identify as a reluctant pastor. People go, "How did you decide you wanted to be a pastor? How did you know you'd be a pastor?" I did not know that I would be a pastor. I didn't always want to be a pastor. And it's really only that I identify as a pastor because I know if I look in the rearview mirror, there's 20 years where that's been my job description. But it still kind of feels like a surprise to me that I ended up here somehow. But I think that's also part why we as a church, probably our greatest demographic, if we were going to talk like that, would be to say that we're for the religiously reluctant. I'm kind of a reluctant pastor for the religiously reluctant. But that was confirmed in some really kind of challenging ways in the beginning of my journey, which was as I began to kick the tires on this idea of, I grew up around the church, had a love-hate relationship with the church. There were such potential I saw there, but also so much kind of harm in my own story around that. I just thought I'd love to see it look different. I'd love to help participate in making it better. And one thing led to another. Next thing you know, I'm at seminary and I'm, a couple volunteer roles, got to paid roles, I think I'm a part of this denomination and they want to potentially ordain me and let me be kind of a legitimate pastor of sorts. And one of the last steps after you take all the tests on theology and history of religion and preaching and all that stuff is they do a psych eval. And I'm like, well, this will be the easiest one yet. And I go to this counselor's office. I had to drive an hour and a half out into the country somewhere, sit down, and this therapist hands me essentially like a long, what felt like a personality profile. And it was all multiple choice, bubble answers and the rest. And so it's just all kinds of questions like you can imagine about the way you're wired and what fires you up and drive. And so I answered everything pretty enthusiastically. Yeah, that's totally me. Nah, not me at all. Yeah, that's me, whatever. And this guy's been doing this for our denomination here in North Carolina for, 30 or 40 years. And at the end, I turn in my bubble sheet and I'm like, here you go. He runs it through his little Scantron deal. And and his whole tone and demeanor change. And he invites me to come back into his office, and he says, "So, we kind of need to talk. I've been doing this for a very long time, and I've never seen results like this. So," and I was like, "Oh, like that good? Like what's the deal, right?" And he essentially says, "Tell me why you want to be a pastor again." And I'm like, "Well, I love the church. I want to see it do better. I had a deep personal connection. I think that this is a place that addresses some of the most important questions in life, all this kind of stuff." He goes, that's really compelling sitting here in front of you. But the problem is when I read this sheet, like your profile looks nothing like the pastors that we've come to kind of expect and receive. And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He goes, "Well, to put it bluntly, like your profile looks a whole lot more like maybe a leader of a large corporation or organization, a lot less like a pastor." And I just said, "Well, what does that mean?" He said, "Well, typically pastors tend to be a lot more, caring or compassionate or pastoral, in the sense that these are people you want next to your bedside when you're dying. Your profile looks like you're the guy we need when we need to fire 500 people in a day, and you're still fine to go home and eat dinner later, And so I was like, "Well, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think I would have a hard time, firing 500 people, but I do think I'm the kind of person, if that hard call had to happen, I would make it. I would struggle with it." I said, "But I definitely care for people. I mean, that's what would motivate me to do that, is to save an organization or to do the right thing." I said, "Can I?" He's like, "Well, I just don't know how I'm going to pass you." And I'm like, "Can I take the test again?" And so he let me go back and take the test. And I basically answered all the same way. I just took some of the enthusiasm out a little bit, like, "Yeah, that's sort of like me," and a little, and somehow passed by the skin of my teeth. And so just got through, I think, with a little extra interview to let me slide. But to this day, I think that test and experience summarizes a lot of my fit or lack thereof sometimes in the traditional church model, and what churches have come to expect of a pastor or a leader in the way that I operate. But yeah, that's not like the most glowing.
I think that story, again, it's kind of like you took a test that basically identified you as somebody that was not a fit for the job you were just about to take. And I think a lot of that is true with leaders. I don't know that there's necessarily a test you take that says, "Okay, you're a high potential, so you've got everything that it takes." It's sort of a work in progress no matter what. And to a lot of the people that you interact with and that you talk about that come from business, and you interact with in your church, what is the difference between, if there is one, between the leadership that you do, or, by the way, that anybody in your role with any different kind of religion would do? What is the role of leadership in that context as it compares to at least how you perceive what goes on in organizations on a day-to-day basis in small, medium, and large companies?
Yeah. Wow. I love that question. I think it's because I really love leaders, and that's been one of the great gifts of our church, is that for whatever reason, I think it probably does have something to do with just kind of the way I'm wired, but we draw a lot of marketplace leaders to join us. And I think that really just comes from my own empathy as somebody who, the church I lead, I started, 5, 6, 7 years ago. And so that process has shown me how much is actually in common, that there's so much. My own experience of leading and building a church has given me a lot more empathy for people who lead, build, and structure organizations, companies, and the rest. That there's so much of it that's the same, that we, both of us are trying to serve a population. Both of us are trying to add value in the world. Both of us, end up in places where we're managing the mess of people, and people are just messy and complicated, and it's never as easy as you imagine. And leading something is just an incredibly vulnerable experience, no matter whether it's a church or a business, of just feeling, imposter syndrome is kind of a real thing, I think, for every leader, of that waking up in the middle of the night, not being able to sleep, the million problems. Am I the right guy or girl? Can I pull this off? Do I have what it takes? Do people trust me? Will they follow me? All of that, I think, is largely the same. And I kind of hesitate a little bit to point out the differences, because many times, especially younger, when I would talk about, well, you don't understand, being a pastor is totally different. Really generous friends who are in the for-profit space would say, nope, not so different. We have the same. Yep, like you're not as special as you think, you know. And but a couple things that I think are just interesting about the difference between, say, leading a church, in my experience of leading a church and leading, say, a business. One is just the expectation that's put on pastors for how they will lead. So I think this is a deficit of the church, honestly, but that the church traditionally, at least kind of in America, and I would say probably especially evangelicalism, it has often understands the pastor, like I said, that profile earlier, to be someone who would never raise conflict, who would never challenge, who would never fire anybody, who would simply just encourage and prop up and support, and it's just sunshine and roses and handwritten cards and visitation and all of that all the time, and not necessarily an organizational leader who's looking for ways for us to kind of win and to advance the mission and to find efficiencies and the rest. And I'm obviously wired more as that latter, and so coming up against the expectations and the whiplash that people in the church sometimes have when they bump into a pastor who's maybe a little bit more wired that way has been interesting and challenge. The one that I honestly struggle with the most, though, is the unique relationship that pastors or church leaders have to their, let's just say, customers, right? And so as a pastor, one of the interesting things is that our customers are often also our employees, in the sense that we're a volunteer-led organization. And so it's a really interesting thing to kind of serve a demographic that's your customer, and then to find out that they feel like they own this organization because they volunteer here. And so I'll just say the feedback flows freely, right? Like one of the things that's interesting about a church is you've heard all the cliches, but there's just people are very quick to say, I didn't like the way that looked, or this happened, or the sermon was this, and the music wasn't whatever. And I used to take offense at that. I've come to see that's actually real ownership. It's because they don't see themselves just as customers. Like, I don't write big, giant, long emails to Target or McDonald's or whatever. But it's because they see themselves as employees. They see this as they're a shareholder, right? And so our relationship to our customers sometimes feels a little different. And also in a community like ours, our customers are also often our community, which is interesting. In some ways, I feel like the church often feels a little bit more like one of those businesses you see on social media or online where you invite all your friends, right? And so your customer ends up becoming your friends, which makes things complicated too. When you're sitting around the bonfire one night, having beers, hanging out, and they want to talk about your performance, right? It's just most people's friends aren't that aware or even interested in business leaders' performance at work. And so there's things like that. And just our connection to, once again, you just bear with me, give me a charitable listen here, but our connection to our product, right, is deeply intimate. Like, it's a big problem for a pastor to maybe start to fall out of love with their product in a way that it might not be. Like, you could probably manage it a little bit better if you're selling a certain kind of widget that you yourself don't use at home, right? I mean, one of my favorite stories that I've heard Alan Mulally talk about, and he actually says this is a problem, but when he first started at Ford, pulling up into the parking lot and seeing nobody was driving Fords, right? And so he tried to fix that, but those folks, for better or for worse, didn't feel that integrity stretch the way that it'd be pretty hard to be a pastor and get up and do what you do without being 100% sold out to your kind of message every day. But once again, people probably disagree and say, hey, those are all problems we face too. But in the church, that's often what we moan about.
Well, I can tell you there are some obvious parallels, but again, like some differences. And we got one question that came in here from Andrew. Like motivating people, volunteer organization.
Yeah.
Like, what's up with that? How do you go about that? Is that a case by case thing, or is there you kind of a certain way that you go about that, or what does that look like? Getting people, pumped up, or increasing their confidence to do something that they may not really want to do.
Yeah, and I think it'll be clear throughout our conversation, but I am a pastor who feels like the church has a whole lot to learn from the business world. But I also think that the business world has some things to learn from the church. And this is one of those areas where I think kind of the for-profit space should pay more attention to the church. And because the church is a volunteer-led organization, because so much of what happens here on a Sunday, I mean, we have a handful of staff, but it takes hundreds of people to pull off a Sunday, of people who are doing this, who are volunteering, who don't have to, who aren't getting paid or compensated in any way for this, and are choosing to do this. What I think that forces churches to take very seriously is being crystal clear about their mission and vision, in a way that sometimes I think for-profit folks can get off without, because most of the people pushing it forward are often paid to be there and to do their thing. But when you realize this won't succeed without people giving their time freely, you start to learn that people will respond to vision, or they'll respond to mission, and it has to be communicated really clearly. And it's one of the things that's always surprised me. And part of it's just the role of my job and the nature of our industry. But there's a lot of really great communicators in the church space. But whether that's just for lack of opportunity or lack of value, it seems that so many of my friends who are in business, that if the moment should present itself where it's time to communicate their vision or their mission or what they're trying to do in the world, or to bring customers on, that they're often ill-equipped for that there just isn't as much space or attention or priority given to just communication, selling, winning, in those same sorts of ways, especially around a mission or a vision that I think is what emotionally motivates people to join you. And the companies that do and that take their communication really seriously, you see that it pays off. And so in the church, so much of what we do obviously hangs on that, of making sure that everybody knows this is why we exist and this is where we're headed, and we can't get there without you, and you're a part of something bigger. And we've worked really hard to communicate that as clearly as we can, so that you know whether we're the people for you and help you make that decision, faster. But
yeah, you're several people kind of chiming in here. It's like, Jameen and Ann and a few others, just like, communication, when you get right down to it, is always the key. How often, how much, it's almost like you can't possibly do enough, regardless of what organization you're in.
Yeah.
But I do think you're right. I think in so many different ways, I think there is a lot that for-profit organizations, can learn from volunteer organizations, and are learning volunteer organizations. And in that context, you have to live in a wholesome place a long ways away from other people not to have heard about servant leadership. And,
sure.
And the umbrella, that servant leadership, puts over the, kind of leadership development. And I'm in this industry, and sometimes for me, it's very difficult to figure out, how does this fit with this, fit with this, fit with this? How do all these pieces of this puzzle, sort of come together? But from your standpoint, servant leadership, what message does that have for all of us, and what's the essence of it? Kind of what can we all? Maybe that's even in our family setting where we're leading. In our families, how is being a servant leader something that could benefit all of us?
Yeah. So, I think for the longest time, if I was asked that, I probably would just respond with something like, to kind of quote the Pat Summitt section in here, like, no task is beneath a leader, right? I love the stories of like CEOs and giant companies cleaning up bathrooms, or picking up trash in the hallway, or sending a note to somebody that's much further down, and all of those things I think that's absolutely true. I think the challenge for me around servant leadership in the last couple of years, I've really been wrestling with it. I actually don't have a problem doing all the mundane tasks. I often enjoy it. I like, I'm happy to tidy up, to organize, to take a task that folks would maybe think, wouldn't be the best use of my time, but to prove that we're all in this together. I love those moments. The servant leadership that's harder for me is I think gets to, and I don't know if I'll say this clearly, and maybe you can help me articulate this, but part of what I've been learning is that servant leadership is really about serving my leaders, like serving these people who have volunteered their time either as a volunteer or volunteered to work with us, because they could have volunteered to work with someone else and get paid, right? The people who've entrusted a significant amount of their life to this organization, and to serve them and their well-being and their development, right? And I think, kind of as a young leader, and I'm still pretty young, 41, but I think the servant thing for me, or the way I related to staff much of the time, was mostly about managing outcomes. It's, let's find some great talent, and then I'm going to hold them accountable to produce what I want to see, and I will serve them to the degree that I can get them to produce what I want for the organization. And I think the subtle shift that's happening in me, it's harder. It's definitely much harder, but is in some ways the best way to achieve the outcomes we want for our organization is for a second to kind of put them down and to lift our leaders up and to say, how do I serve you? How can I help you grow? How can I develop you? How can I be present for you? How can I help you be the fullest sort of version of a human being that you long to be? And not be scared of the conversations of, where do you want to be 5 or 10 years from now? And it's okay if it's not here. And how do we help you get there, right? And as we serve our actual leaders, they serve the organization in profound ways. But it's taken some work for me to let my grip off of the outcomes I want to see immediately, and start to wrap my arms around these people that I've been entrusted with, so that no matter what comes, and whether they're here 10 years or 20 years, that they look back on this season as a time and space where they were really poured into and invested in, and they grew a lot. And I think as we do that, our organization grows. But that's so much harder, that kind of like character development that's not just competencies, but really developing leaders.
Yeah, it's really interesting, I think, and I want to double back on this whole servant leadership thing, but it's really interesting in organizations when you take people that enter at the base and they're doing a technical job, whatever that technical job is. You know, they're salespeople, or they're in research, or they're in HR, or whatever. And then, you know, they do that for a while and they get pretty good at it. And now it comes time, you know, to get promoted. And when you ask a lot of those folks, and by a lot, I haven't done a study that could say, 86% responded this way. But you say, how come you want to get into management or leadership? And they sort of look at you like you're not that bright, which is not that right. And they say, well, it's like, well, that's more stuff, right? Like I'm here, I'm working here. There's more money, there's more of this. Or like eventually, where I want to go with my career is here, and I got to touch second base before I go to third. Rarely do you hear somebody say something like, well, I've mastered a lot of this stuff. I really dig what we're doing here at this organization. I really think I could help, a lot of people, that we're bringing in. I really think that I am now at a point in my career where I could give them the benefit of my experience and listen to really where they want to go, and help them and be a steward for them to move forward. But when you take a look at some of the people in corporate America that are the most successful, that's exactly what they do. I mean, it was mentioned here, a couple of comments. Al Mulally, if you take a look at his principles at Ford, it was all about serving others. It was all about, I'm here for the person. Of course, we work in an organization. Anytime you work in an organization, you give up some personal freedom. So you have to be kind of bought into what's going on at the organization. But I'm buying into the person to help them get where they want to go. And by the way, if that's out of the organization, that's fine. But that's my role. That's my job. We got stuff to do. But where do you fit into this? And what are you passionate about? And all of that sort of thing. Also, that doesn't translate to a particular approach, which I think is a problem. And you asked for some clarity here, so long as you clear. A lot of times you think servant leadership is just participative management. It's just, well, what do you think? It's empowerment. It's, well, hey man, where do you want to go? What do you want to do? That's cool. Let's do it. A lot of times it's not that. A lot of times people don't know what they need. They know what they want, but they don't know what they need. So service, the whole idea of servant leadership, to me, it's more of a philosophy. And something like the stuff we teach, situational leadership, it's more of a model or a repeatable framework that helps you live that out. Sometimes you got to give direction. Sometimes you
Sure. Yeah.
Sometimes
Yep.
you provide empowerment. But
Yeah.
I really do think there is a ton there. And from the looks of things, many of the people that are listening in today, wholeheartedly, believe that as well. You said a bunch of very interesting things during our interview for the book, but one of them was one of the first lessons you learned as a leader was the best ideas don't always win.
Yeah.
That really sounds depressing. But
Yeah, it is.
maybe you can put a positive spin on that for me. Like what is that and how does it relate to leadership?
Yeah. So, I think I can be kind of cerebral, and man, if I wasn't doing this, there's a part of me that I love a good argument. I love great logic, reason, all the rest. I think for a long time I thought leaders are just the smartest people in the room. They're just the ones who had the best ideas, and that the best ideas just make their way to the top, and that's kind of how this world works. And then you get inside of it and see that we're not rational creatures. Even we're emotional human beings that are highly relational, and the way that you bring people together and pursue something as a team, which is really the only way that anything great happens in the world, is through a pretty high EQ, like this sort of relational dynamic of self-awareness of who you are and who you're working with and what motivates them and how to connect with them. And so I think, to kind of your point about there's harnessing the competencies that you have, but on behalf of these people that you're called to serve, and walking alongside them in a way that I think I've learned that I used to think it was enough just to be right. But sometimes you got to be patient, and you got to slow down and spend time and help build consensus and bring folks along. And just being right is not a guarantee that it'll happen. To kind of use a church quote here, and I know not everybody on here would identify as religious or even Christian for that regard, but there's this little phrase that we use around the church sometimes that we stole from a guy named Bob Goff. But he says, don't be right, be Jesus, right? And his point is sort of like, some of us are just such a-holes, and we're so caught up in being right, and we think that being right is what's going to get it done. He's like, don't be right, be Jesus, and kind of show some humility, some mercy, some love, some kindness, like walk with people. Yeah, you can be right too, but like there's something much better and more beautiful than that, and it's actually way more effective. And if I spent a little bit more time listening and engaging and relating to the people that I'm trying to build consensus with, my life would be a lot easier than just stuck in these never-ending arguments where I know I'm right and they're wrong, but isn't yielding kind of what we need to see happen, if that helps.
Yeah. No, that's very, very good. I know that you had the opportunity, I can tell just from chatting with you here as well, to kind of, at least thumb through, some of the other chapters of the book and see what was going on. And believe me, it was very, very difficult, as I hope you can imagine. And your interview was no exception to this, but it was tough calling this work, right? Like sitting down with the 15 people I sat down with in the book and asking them questions about leadership. Who were some of the other contributors in Lessons from Leaders that you found yourself, reading it and going, oh yeah, that's, for that matter, just any thoughts you had on the other contributors at all?
Yeah, well, I love the book, and I was, fortunate to get a little early release and walk through that a couple months back, and then viewed it actually this afternoon, and it felt like it was hitting kind of my current situations in all new, fresh ways. But I'll say, typically for me, that this, I think maybe I'm a bit of a masochist, but the parts that grab me the most are the ones that sort of sting the most. The parts that sort of stung or challenged or kind of inspired me. I love the Frances Hesselbein's chapter. Was so inspiring and compelling. There was two things from her chapter that I really loved. One was this image of when she took over as, I think it was the president of the Girl Scouts, that she had this decision where chair, she was able to select a vice chair, and then she selected kind of somebody to present, and basically brought unions and labor folks together in the same room and raised more money than ever been raised in that county. And it's just a reminder of that's the inspiring parts of leadership for me, especially in this moment, in this day and age, is how do you bring people together in the church, but honestly anywhere at this point, who see the world very differently and bring about some good. And I think when we can do that, it's actually got this profound multiplier effect. The degree of difficulty is high, but if you take the risk and you pull it off, the reward is too. And so I love that part of her story, which also shows up in Daryl Davis's story, right? Of here's a guy who befriends the very people who discount his humanity. And it's hard to wrap your head around that kind of leadership and compassion and care. But I've been blessed to actually meet him. And yeah, I mean, it's one of those experiences you never get over. And just revisiting his story was really important to me. The other part of Francis's chapter that pops up elsewhere is in that Alan Mulally chapter, but both of them kind of lead out with this idea that I think is the most challenging part of leadership to me now. I used to get mad about whether the best ideas win. Now I think the thing that's most challenging about leadership is that Alan Mulally says leadership isn't about what you do, it's about who you are. The leaders it's just who you are. What's your character? Does anybody want to follow you? Are people lifted by being in your presence? Are they inspired? Would they trust you? Right. And man, I really wish it was more of a strategy or a technique I could learn on a Tuesday afternoon in a webinar than my whole character being kind of largely the judge of my leadership often. But Frances Hesselbein says the exact same thing. She says, it's not how to do something, but how you're being, how you are in the world that's most important. And I think that's the thread that I see in so many of the people in this book that you've highlighted. These are people just great. It's super simple, but it's the most simple parts of leadership that I think are most challenging. It's this integrity question. And anybody can win in the short term without it, but nobody does or leaves a legacy long term without doing that self work. And as much as I want to develop other people, the truth is sometimes as much as I'd rather just do work or maybe not develop other people, I probably get more resistance within myself to developing myself than I do to anyone else, that's where the battles I think won and lost in leadership is how much change are you willing to undergo to see these things happen. So I love the whole book. And if folks haven't had the chance to kind of read it or review it, I'd strongly recommend all of it, but I love Alan and Frances and Daryl's chapters a lot.
Yeah, I would tell you that if there is a common theme, I think among all 15, but those three in particular, and those are really high profile leaders. Daryl and Frances and Alan. They have done things with hundreds of thousands of people who have an impact, around the world. But it's like there is this simplicity on the other side of complexity. Leadership is always described as simple, right? Anytime it's a simple thing, right? They were just acting genuinely, but there's a lot you got to work through, mostly inside yourself, to figure out, how do I feel about this? How do I feel about that? What would this look like? What would that look like? Why does this person bother me? Why do I find myself agreeing with? Leaders are very thoughtful people, and they really work their way through a ton of the complexity, and they develop a maturity that the rest of us just sort of admire, because when they get into these sets of circumstances that distinguish them as leaders, as you do, in your role, it's kind of like you stand back and you marvel at it. Like I, for instance, Daryl Davis, to me, everybody in the book was great. People say pick a favorite. I say, I got a bunch of them. They say, no, pick a favorite. And no offense to you, but I say I can't imagine being Daryl Davis. I cannot imagine being an African American in this day and age, showing up at KKK rallies, and at great personal risk, obviously, but with an intention. And the intention is, ironically, to listen and to provide to these people that hate you, and have hated you their entire lives, this dissonance of, here is this person doesn't act or think or talk or present themselves in any way, shape, or form with sort of this image that I have of these people that I've been brought up to have opinions about. I remember in Davis's conversation in particular, like where he kind of got into all this in a serious way. He started thinking about it when he was about 10, but he was a accomplished jazz musician, rhythm and blues musician, Hall of Fame rhythm and blues piano player, as you know, and I know from having watched him play. And there was a guy that came up to him after a gig he was playing, white man in Virginia somewhere many years ago, and asked him, like, where did a black guy ever figure out how to play the piano like Jerry Lee Lewis? And just to think about how insulting that question must have been, like, well, where do you think Jerry Lee Lewis learned how to play like this?
Right. Sure. Yeah.
But just the maturity and the expectation that, okay, you're going to get asked some pretty insulting things. And the immediate stimulus response is that you're going to fight. You're going to go at them. You're going to call them a name. And then before you know it, you're into this thing that we see every night on television. But leaders have the ability to get, management and unions together and have a peaceful discussion. And it's amazing what happens when to get people that think they're apart together in the same room and say, come on, let's figure something out here. But in that context, I think for what it's worth, the reason you were in the book, you do that as well in a very very controversial, may be the wrong word, but there's a stigma that comes with religion and being a pastor and being all of that sort of thing. And you do a great job with that. Interested in the time we have left here, how has COVID, because we got to talk about COVID, it's almost a rule these days.
Oh yeah.
How has that changed what you do, your organization, your leadership? Sort of, what are some of the unexpected downsides of that as a leader of a church, and maybe even some unexpected upsides of that? How has all of this the last year, how has it affected you and your church and your
Oh man, that's great. Thank you for asking. I know that's we're all slowly growing weary of sharing our COVID stories and looking to turn the page and celebrate a little bit more here. But it has absolutely impacted us. I mean, it has shaped us profoundly. And I mean, the obvious answer on the surface, I guess, just kind of our offerings. We went from being in person to being online. We'd never done that before. We made most of our meetings move to Zoom. All these sorts of things that I think every organization who has had to innovate in some of those ways. But the legacy of COVID, I think, for our church will be much deeper than just some new tactics or strategies or putting, more bits online. And the first big thing that COVID did for us is it gave us a chance to stop. I think we, like a lot of organizations, we were actually blessed to be doing pretty well, and but we were just a hamster on a wheel. We had gotten to a point of we just kept churning and out, doing the same thing over and over again. And when all of that sort of stopped for a second there in the beginning, it just got real quiet, and it was kind of scary, but it gave us space to start talking about what we do and why we do it, and do we still love doing it, and do we still want to do it, and should we fight to keep this thing alive for another 6 months or a year, however long it's going to be. And those conversations ended up being so helpful, and it gets all the way to the roots for us of our very mission. We started by saying to our whole team and staff, is this mission that we kind of put together, that's to wake you up in the morning? Is that why we come and do this? Is that going to be enough to sustain us through this kind of disruption? Is this why you signed up to be here? Do we believe in this like we once did, or maybe we never did? It just created an atmosphere for honesty. And I think we kind of learned that, like, the way we used to organize ourselves, there was things about that were close, but not complete story. There was a better way to say who we were, and we needed to find that language so we could inspire ourselves to keep moving forward. So it got to our very mission, as well as, because we were forced online, we saw some surprising results, positive results that I think has reshaped our vision for the next 5 to 10 years, and the kind of church we thought we would be, and the sorts of things we thought we would be doing. Those are some of the unintended, I think, benefits. The downside, I think of it, well, and one other benefit is I think we all just realized how tired we were, and that we needed to protect our time a little better, and to find ways to rest. And many of us had zero hobbies and all that kind of stuff. And that early season of COVID, I think we all were really relishing, like, wow, I didn't realize how nice it is to have a meal at home with my family, or to be home at night, or to have a full weekend free, or maybe not to have something scheduled every night of the week. You know what I mean? And so I think all of us were looking at the quality of our lives and going, how do we operate as an organization that makes that possible in the future, not only for our staff, but how do we recommend that to our congregation? How do we work in that direction? So there's so many positives. I think the deficit, the part that was hard was the last year was really, really hard, I think, for a lot of churches, who we are blessed to be in front of our quote unquote customers, our congregation, most every week. We get this immediate positive feedback. We see the impact of the work we're doing in a way that most organizations, businesses don't. And to have that taken away for a year was really hard. And I think most of us did pretty good for the first 3 to 6 months, but somewhere around the winter, it got dark. It just got like, what are we doing? Is there anybody out there? What's the point of all this? You know, as much as we believed in what we were doing, we weren't seeing the results. We'd see numbers of people or devices, not even people. We see numbers of devices that join us, but it wasn't the same thing. And so I think that's one of the things that that was a downside, but it also will become an upside, because it's helped us just remember how much we value people and relationships, and that people matter more than any of our kind of analytics and all the rest. And so I think we're coming back with an enthusiasm for just the real human stuff of life, and how do we preserve that, those one-on-one connections, those little moments of rest, those kind of opportunities to do something fun together and to be connected to friends and family. All those really, it's like leadership, you said, it's like the second naivete, like all those really simple things that we all knew and rolled our eyes at are now the things that I think we know deep down are what matter most. And that's been a great lesson for us.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And I think the applicability of that message goes across industry around the world. It's like, if nothing else, the last year gave all of us the opportunity, to take a strong look and say, what matters? What's really important? Is this what I want to be doing? Am I the kind of person? Like all of that, I think is so very well stated. Final question. So make sure we finish strong here. Okay. So I want you.
All right.
If you had one bit of advice, like one thing, like you got somebody that's an aspiring leader, take age out of it. They've never really dove into the leadership pool before. If you were going to give that individual one piece of advice on becoming a better leader, everything that you've experienced, from everything that you read, and I know you are a voracious reader. What would it be? What would that one thing be? Go do this.
Okay. So I tried to do one. I'm gonna do it quick because I know our time's up. But the one I would steal or borrow and there's been different mottos that have got me through different seasons of leadership in life. But the one that I return to, the mantra I return to the most these days, is a Brené bit, and it's her mantra of like a strong back, a soft front, and a wild heart. And I think that's the tension of leadership, is how do you stay human, have a soft front, right? Like thick skin is not always kind of the win, but I think we sort of defer to that sometimes. But how do you stay soft, compassionate, empathic to the people you're leading, to the folks you're trying to serve and add value to in the world? How do you keep that soft front when you get the hard emails and the critique and the criticism and the challenge? How do you stay soft, but also having a strong back, right? And being able to say, but someone has to make the call, and I think this is the right decision, or this is what we need to do. But not getting so lost in that tension that you lose sight of what, honestly, for me, has always made this fun, which is the wild heart, right? Is like, but what are we building? What are we dreaming? What's worth our time? Why keep managing the soft front and the strong back? Like, what's the thing that motivates us and moves us forward? And so that phrase is really a a mantra for me. And some days I need to hear the strong back part. Some days I need the soft front part. Some days I need the wild heart part. But those three, to me, really feels like one of the best encapsulations of the experience of leadership and what it feels like day to day and how to do it well. The personal anecdotal experience for me that I would share with a aspiring leader, young leaders, just to early on build seasons of rest. I can't tell you how many terrible leadership decisions I've nearly made or honestly have made for lack of rest, for just going too hard, pushing too far. And it's just amazing how different life looks if you take a night off, if you completely shut it down for a weekend, if you actually go on vacation for a week. I mean, I was just talking to someone about this week about, during COVID, there was a pretty dark season for me where I just was like, I'm not sure I can keep doing this. And I've just been trained enough now through my own past experience to go, I need to get out of town. And as ridiculous as it was, my buddy and I got in a van and we drove down to Key West and drove back, kind of lived this ridiculous 7-day adventure. And by the time I got home, I was filled again with energy and ideas and reminded why I love what I do. But if I don't go on that trip, I mean, I honestly was within hours of making, a really bad decision. And so I think leaders really, especially motivated, ambitious, driven, passionate, I can't sleep because I got too much I got to do leaders, really risk losing so much of what they have to offer to the world because they don't see the gift of rest. So I just kind of, as pastors to business folks, take a break. It's okay. Shut it down. You can miss the next Zoom and it will pay huge dividends. So those would be my 2 bits.
For the people that didn't miss this one, I'm sure their time was well spent. I sincerely enjoy every opportunity I have to listen to you or talk with you, and this is no exception. I appreciate you being part of Lessons from Leaders, and I appreciate your time here today. Suze, I'll kick it back to you, but Justin, thank you very much on behalf of all.
Thank you, Sam. It's really humbling. Appreciate it.
I agree. Thank you guys both so much for such a great hour and for all the leadership lessons shared. If you were interested in learning more about Justin Morgan or Lessons from Leaders, please visit lessonsfromleadersbook.com. And lastly, if you're interested in signing up for future events, please register on the Center for Leadership Studies LinkedIn company page. We really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
This book will give you a wide array of really interesting, thoughtful, and practical ideas from some incredibly wise people.
It provides such a rich variety of leadership journeys from so many great leaders with different backgrounds, experiences, and areas of focus and service.
I think you're going to find this entertaining, it's going to be practical, and it's lessons from leaders that you can take back and use.
Pick up a copy of Lessons from Leaders.